Wait, are you seriously firing me? Jack's voice stayed steady, but disbelief hung in every word. The manager folded his arms and gave a smug smile. We don't have use for old school workers anymore. The new system can handle what you do. Jack Morgan tightened his grip around the termination letter. 3 decades of commitment, wiped out in favor of a machine. 2 weeks later, the city plunged into darkness. No one understood what was going on until a patrol car tore through the streets toward the power plant, sirens screaming through the night. How did it all unravel so fast? What caused everything to fall apart after Jack walked away? Jack had dedicated 30 years of his life to Horizon Energy. And in all that time, nothing had ever felt as off as today. He stood inside the workshop, working the stiffness from his shoulders while the familiar sense of metal and scorched wires clung to the air. The usual background noise, the low thrum of machinery and scattered chatter, filled the space, but something was different. The conversations were muted, nervous looks darted around, and a heavy tension loomed like a brewing storm. People had been whispering for months. The company was going through changes, leaning hard into automation, phasing out its older workforce. Jack had heard this kind of talk before. But Horizon always needed people like him, folks who didn't just operate the system, but knew it inside and out. Then Luis, one of the younger techs, appeared in the doorway. His jaw was tight, his voice tense. They want to see you upstairs. Jack didn't say a word. He wiped his hands on a rag, tossed it onto the bench, and started toward the conference room with glass walls overlooking the plant floor. Deep down, he already knew how this was going to play out. Inside, the new executive sat in a neat line, suit spotless, shoes tapping the floor like metronomes. At the head of the table was Martin Crane, the man who'd taken over leadership 6 months earlier. He didn't even glance up as Jack stepped in. Just flipped open a folder and cleared his throat. "Jack," he said smoothly, his tone clearly practiced. "You've been with Horizon Energy a long time, and we do recognize that. But as you know, we're transitioning to a more advanced model. With AI-powered grid management, we'll be able to optimize power flow automatically, without relying on manual input." Jack folded his arms. "So what's that supposed to mean?" Crane sighed as if the answer should have been obvious. "We're downsizing. And as part of that process, your position is being phased out." The room went silent. Jack let out a dry, almost amused breath. "Phased out," he echoed. He leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the table. "You honestly think a computer system that's never lived through a real outage, never crawled through a frozen substation, never had to make a judgment call in the middle of a storm, is going to keep this city running?" Crane didn't blink. "The system's undergone extensive testing." Jack gave a slight shake of his head. "Yeah. And when it crashes?" Without missing a beat, Crane slid a crisp white envelope across the table. "Then it's no longer your responsibility." Jack stared at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. The printed words inside couldn't touch what actually mattered, the decades he'd spent keeping the city's grid alive. The countless moments when people's lives had depended on the decisions he made in the middle of the night, when no one else was around. And now, it was all being boiled down to a form letter and a quiet exit. He let out a slow breath and pushed away from the table. "You're making a big mistake." Crane offered a hollow smile. "Time will tell." Jack left without another word. As he stepped back onto the workshop floor, he could feel every eye on him. Some of the younger workers looked away, clearly uncomfortable. The older ones, those who'd been around as long as he had, gave him small, silent nods. They knew. He grabbed his toolbox. The metal handle felt cool and familiar in his hand. Every nick and dent was a memory, a piece of the life he'd built. As he reached the exit, he paused and glanced back at the machines, the control panels, the steady hum of a system he had helped shape. It all looked the same. But it wasn't. Not anymore. That evening, He sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand, staring out at the city skyline. Beneath those streets ran the grid he'd dedicated his life to, still humming, still alive, but more vulnerable than anyone in a suit could possibly understand. He took a long sip, his jaw tightening. Horizon Energy thought they were done with him. But Jack knew better. They'd be back. Jack Morgan was never the kind of man who could sit still. After walking away from Horizon, he couldn't shake the restlessness. His hands itched for the weight of a wrench, the spark of live wires, the steady drone of transformers. That world had been his for 30 years. And now, he was expected to leave it all behind, like it had meant nothing. At first, he tried to embrace the time off. His wife, Elena, had been nudging him for years to slow down, enjoy home more, maybe pick up fishing like the other retired guys in the neighborhood. But Jack wasn't wired for stillness. By the end of the first week, Jack was already back in his garage. He couldn't help himself, tinkering with old circuit boards, fixing blown outlets and wiring issues for neighbors who still trusted his hands more than any manual. Word had gotten around the block. If something sparked or shorted, Jack was the guy you called. Meanwhile, over at Horizon Energy, things weren't going nearly as smoothly. The automated grid system, the very same technology that had made Jack redundant, was starting to show cracks. At first, the issues seemed minor. A few quick flickers here and there in residential neighborhoods. Blips that were chalked up to routine fluctuations, something the AI was supposed to compensate for. But the techs watching the data stream started to notice something unsettling. The blackouts weren't random. There was a pattern. Then came the hit to the restaurant district. It was a busy Friday evening, just as the dinner rush hit full swing. Without warning, the power went out. 3 minutes of darkness. The system eventually restarted and electricity returned, but by then, the damage was done. Complaint calls flooded the lines. Business owners were livid. Martin Crane, the man behind Horizon's push toward automation, waved it off with a shrug. "It's just a glitch," he told his staff. "The system is adapting. It'll stabilize." But it didn't. The very next night, the same area went dark again. This time, the outage lasted an hour. Restaurants tossed spoiled food, canceled bookings, and sent customers home. The city's business bureau called Crane directly, demanding answers. Behind the scenes, panic was beginning to set in. Engineers scrambled to make sense of the chaos. The AI monitoring system wasn't flagging any significant faults. According to its diagnostics, everything was functioning as intended. But the outages kept happening. Then came the real scare, St. Vincent's Medical Center. Late one night, the hospital's emergency lighting flickered. Just a few seconds. Barely noticeable to anyone outside. But inside, those seconds could have meant lives. Ventilators, heart monitors, life support systems, all of it depended on a steady stream of power. Backup generators were there, sure, but even a momentary disruption could tip the balance in the worst possible way. The hospital wasted no time. They called Horizon Energy, demanding an immediate explanation. At this point, Horizon's control room had descended into chaos. Engineers huddled around glowing screens, running diagnostics, searching for any clue. All the data still claimed the grid was stable, but reality was screaming otherwise. Crane stood at the center of it all, his composure starting to crack. "Tell me we have a fix," he snapped at the lead technician. The man looked pale, his voice shaky. "The AI isn't seeing the issue. It's adjusting flow, tweaking voltage, but there's something deeper. Something it doesn't understand. The fluctuations are spreading." Crane clenched his jaw. He didn't want to say it aloud, but the truth was sinking in. Jack had warned them. For decades, Jack had kept the city's power flowing, not just by following rules or protocols, but by instinct. He knew the grid like it was part of him. He understood the quirks, transformers that needed a nudge, circuits that responded better to manual tweaks, neighborhoods where loads had to be balanced just so. The AI could calculate. But it couldn't understand. It ran its formulas, but it didn't grasp the weight of small issues compounding over time, what a veteran could sense before it ever showed up on a screen. The electrical infrastructure wasn't fragile, but it wasn't invincible either. Like an aging bridge, it could carry the weight, as long as someone knew where to reinforce the cracks. Crane took a deep breath. He needed a solution. And fast. Then, at 11:47 p.m. on the dot, the worst-case scenario hit. The entire city went black. Not a scheduled blackout. Not an isolated outage. The grid collapsed, completely. Phones lit up instantly. Calls from the mayor, emergency services, the fire chief. People stuck in elevators. Intersections dark and dangerous. Subway trains frozen in place, passengers stranded in tunnels deep below the city. In the control room, alarms screamed. Engineers shouted over each other, typing frantically. Screens glowed red. Crane felt a chill roll down his spine. Get the system back online, he barked. We're trying, the lead engineer stammered. But the grid's maxed out. The failsafes aren't activating. It's like the power has nowhere to go. Crane's stomach dropped. He stared at his phone, hesitating. Then, reluctantly, he dialed a number he never thought he'd need again. The phone rang once. Twice. Then went straight to voicemail. Jack wasn't picking up. Back at Horizon Energy, the control room had descended into chaos. It was full-blown crisis mode, engineers shouting commands, fingers hammering at keyboards in a desperate scramble to get the automated system back online. Nothing was working. Every monitor showed the same stark message. Grid failure. System unresponsive. Martin Crane stood frozen in the middle of the storm, still holding his phone like he expected it to somehow save him. He had weathered brutal storms and equipment meltdowns in the past, but he'd never witnessed anything like this. This wasn't just a failure. This was a systemic collapse. The backup generators should have kicked in by now, one engineer yelled, panic rising in his voice. They're overloaded, another technician shot back. The system's trying to reroute power, but it's not balancing out. It's like the grid's short-circuiting itself. A tight knot formed in Crane's stomach. He had staked everything on the promise of automation. Sold the board on the dream of a streamlined future without human error. On paper, it was supposed to be flawless. But now, faced with a crisis the system couldn't predict, let alone solve, he was forced to confront a bitter truth. This wasn't a software hiccup. This was what they'd dismissed. This was experience they'd thrown away. Suddenly, new alarms pierced the air. Hospital power is critical, someone called out. Their backup supplies draining too fast. Crane clenched his jaw. If St. Vincent's lost power entirely, people wouldn't just be inconvenienced. They'd die. There was no room left for guesses or slow fixes. They didn't need another line of code, they needed someone who could actually see the problem, someone who knew how this system thought. He redialed Jack's number. Still nothing. Muttering a curse under his breath, Crane tightened his grip on the phone. Jack had spent decades babysitting this grid. He knew the pressure points, the old fail-safes, the manual overrides hidden beneath layers of modernization. Crane turned sharply to his assistant. Find him. Now. Within minutes, a crew was dispatched to Jack's house. When they got there, the place was pitch black, just like the rest of the city. They banged on the door, shouting his name. No response. That's when Luis, the young engineer who had once learned the ropes under Jack, spoke up. He had a feeling in his gut. If he's anywhere, Luis said, he'll be at St. John's. St. John's Community Center sat on the edge of town, a worn-down building that had become a safe haven for families on the edge. Jack had spent countless hours there over the years, fixing frayed wiring, patching up the ancient generator, and making sure the place stayed warm when winter hit hard. And sure enough, when the team arrived, Jack was exactly where Luis thought he'd be. Sitting on the floor, flashlight clamped between his teeth, rewiring a broken panel like it was just another Tuesday. In the corner, the old backup generator sputtered weakly, struggling to keep the lights alive. Luis rushed forward. "Jack, we need you. The grid's out. Completely. Nothing's coming back." Without looking up, Jack responded in a low, even tone. "Yeah. I know." He kept working, hands steady, tightening one last bolt. Crane's assistant stepped forward, breathless. "Please. The hospital's on the verge of losing everything. We're out of time." At last, Jack paused. He set the wrench down gently, let out a long breath, and rose to his feet. His eyes met Luis's for a moment, then drifted to the others. "You all figured I wasn't necessary," he said, voice flat but cutting. Luis nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "We were wrong." Jack wiped his hands clean, pulled on his coat, and nodded toward the door. "Let's move." By the time they got to Horizon's control center, the crisis had deepened. The system wasn't just failing, it was chasing its own tail. The automated grid was stuck in a loop, trying to stabilize itself and making the overload even worse with every pass. Jack scanned the chaos of cascading system failures and immediately shook his head. "They brought everything down too fast," he muttered under his breath. "Now the system's locked in a fight with itself. It's trying to redistribute the load, but the grid was never meant to cold start like this." Crane stood nearby, arms folded tightly across his chest, his eyes locked on Jack. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his voice low, almost cautious. Jack turned and met his gaze squarely. "That depends. Are you finally ready to listen?" Crane let out a hard breath through his nose. He didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. "Just tell me what to do." Jack pivoted to face the control room. "All right, everyone, listen carefully. We've got to stop working against the system. We need to manually reset the primary substations. If we try to bring the entire grid up all at once, we'll blow out half the transformers across the city." A few engineers looked uncertain. "But, the AI. The AI doesn't know what it doesn't know," Jack cut in sharply. "It's treating this like some routine power outage. This is a complete collapse. We have to override the automation and do this the old-fashioned way, boots on the ground, hands on the hardware." He looked around the room. "Who's got a crew ready to move?" Luis didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Within minutes, trucks were dispatched all across the city. Each vehicle carried engineers working directly under Jack's command. His voice was steady, composed, filling the radio waves with clear, decisive instructions. "Substation 3, bypass Relay 5 and flip the manual transfer switch. Don't force it. You'll fry the whole circuit. Team at 14th Street, secure the feeder lines first. If they're unstable, a reboot will take us right back to square one. Hospital's the priority, get their grid stable before we do anything else." Neighborhood by neighborhood, the lights began to return. Street lamps blinked awake. Intersections came back online. Power surged slowly, like a heartbeat restarting after flatlining. When the hospital systems fully stabilized, the radio erupted with exhausted cheers from every corner of the city. And after hours of careful work, the final sector flickered back to life. Inside the control room, the tension finally broke. Engineers slumped in their chairs, drained but deeply relieved. Every screen now glowed with stable readings. Jack pulled off his headset and turned to Crane. "There you go. Your system's back online." Crane rubbed his temples with both hands. Admitting fault didn't come easily to him, but tonight, there was no getting around it. "You saved the city," he said, voice quiet, stripped of ego. Jack shook his head. No. Experience saved the city. Maybe next time, think twice before tossing it aside. Crane gave a slow nod. You thinking about coming back? Jack let out a short laugh as he reached for his coat. Not a chance. He headed for the exit. As he passed through the doorway, Louise called out behind him. So, what now? Jack glanced back, a hint of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I think it's time I open my own shop. Turns out there's still a demand for folks who actually know what they're doing. He stepped outside. The city skyline stretched before him, bright, steady, alive once more. And this time, it wasn't because of some AI running numbers. It was because he had brought it back. Jack walked out of the control room and into the chill of the night air. The silence of the blackout had been replaced by the steady hum of power returning. Neon lights glowed again. Streetlights buzzed faintly overhead. The sounds of life, the chatter, the movement, the relief, floated through the streets like music. From where he stood, he could hear distant cheers echoing through the city, people celebrating, unaware of how close they'd come to the edge. He drew in a deep breath, letting the cold air settle into his lungs. It had been years since he felt this kind of tired, not just the physical kind, but the exhaustion that came from carrying an entire city on your back. It reminded him of those long storm nights, when he pulled double shifts to keep hospitals running and shelters from freezing over. Only this time, it wasn't nature they'd been up against. It was hubris. Just then, Louise jogged up behind him, catching him as he reached the parking lot. You really sure you're not coming back? Louise asked, his hands buried in his pockets, his voice landing somewhere between admiration and a quiet kind of pleading. Jack let out a soft chuckle and gave his head a firm shake. Not happening. Louise let out a slow breath. Yeah. I figured. Still, it's gonna feel different without you around. Jack studied him for a beat, really took him in. The kid had something. He wasn't just another name on a schedule or someone clocking in and out. He cared, and in this line of work, that kind of heart was getting harder to find. Look, Jack said, you don't need me standing over your shoulder. What you do need is to stop trusting a system that can't think on its own. Louise hesitated, then nodded, the weight of everything finally settling on his face. I knew something was off. I just didn't know how to prove it. That's the difference, Jack said. Between reading numbers and understanding a system. Data doesn't always tell you the whole story. Sometimes, you've got to trust your instincts. Louise nodded again, this time with more certainty. So what now? You just, walk away from all this. Jack gave a small smirk. I'm not walking away. I'm walking toward something better. He turned and left Louise standing there in the glow of the parking lot lights, then climbed into his old truck. As the engine rumbled to life, that familiar vibration beneath him brought a sense of calm nothing else could match. As he drove out of the lot, he spotted Crane at the entrance, arms folded, watching him leave. He finally understood. But the realization had come at a price. Now the question was whether it would actually change him. Cruising through the city, Jack saw the lingering traces of the blackout everywhere. Intersections still needed recalibrating, traffic cops waved drivers through tangled lanes. Storefronts were being swept clean, broken glass glinting under street lamps. People gathered on porches, trading stories like they'd lived through a natural disaster. Truth be told, they kind of had. Horizon had taken a gamble, and they'd lost. Jack had stepped in and cleaned up their mess, this time. But he wouldn't be there to do it again. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the exhaustion hit him like a wave. Elena was waiting on the porch, arms crossed with that familiar, knowing look on her face. She didn't ask a single question. She'd already seen the headlines, heard the sirens, and felt the lights come back on. You saved the city, didn't you? She asked, her voice soft, threaded with pride. Jack sighed as he stepped up next to her. I just did what I've always done. She handed him a cold beer, leaning on the railing beside him. So, did they beg you to come back? He took a long, quiet sip, then gave a small grin. Oh yeah. He paused. And I told them to figure it out themselves. She laughed gently, shaking her head. About damn time. They sat in companionable silence, letting the hum of a recovering world fill the space between them. But Jack wasn't stuck on what had just happened. His mind was already moving on. The next morning, well before the sun came up, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Groggy, Jack reached over, half expecting Crane's name to pop up on the screen. But it wasn't him. It was a private energy firm, one that specialized in infrastructure consulting for cities still running on aging grids. We heard about what happened last night, said the voice on the other end. We'd like to talk. Jack let out a quiet laugh, barely hiding the smirk pulling at his lips. Of course they would. By midday, he was seated in a sleek downtown office, sipping coffee across from a group of well-dressed executives who looked at him like he was a leftover from another era. But Jack wasn't fooled by the suits or the fancy view. He knew something they clearly didn't. Experience doesn't go out of style. The meeting didn't last long. They offered him a deal, one built on his conditions, not theirs. No more reporting to corporate middlemen. No more answering to people who put profits over people. He wouldn't be anyone's employee. He'd be a consultant, an independent hand who showed up when things hit the fan and taught people how to fix it right. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Respect. By the time Jack walked out of that building, the paperwork was signed and sealed. He didn't just walk away with a job offer, he walked away with control. On the drive home, he made a stop at Oak Hill Community Center. The place was still running on backup power, but it was holding steady, for now. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Not because anyone was paying him. Not because there'd be a headline about it. But because people needed someone who would simply show up and fix what was broken. That had always been who he was. As the sun slipped behind the skyline and bathed the city in gold, his phone buzzed again. Luis. I thought you said you weren't coming back, Luis said, a trace of laughter in his voice. I'm not, Jack replied, tossing his toolbox into the back of his truck. But if you ever need real help, you know where to find me. He ended the call and looked back toward the horizon, the city glowing softly under a sky that had nearly gone dark for good. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack was certain he'd made the right call. Later that night, he sat on the porch, cold beer in hand. The breeze carried the low hum of a city still shaking off the dust of near disaster. Condensation trickled down the bottle and onto his fingers, but he didn't notice. He had spent most of his life making sure no one ever had to think about the grid, the quiet machinery that kept hospitals running, streetlights glowing, and families safe in the dark. Now, for once, people understood what it really took to keep the lights on. His phone buzzed on the side table. He let it ring twice before glancing down. Martin Crane. Jack let out a slow breath and answered. You've got a lot of nerve calling me, he said, his tone steady, firm. There was a pause on the other end. For once, Crane's voice didn't carry the weight of ego. I know you're not coming back, he said. I just wanted to say, thank you. Jack let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You're not calling to thank me. You're trying to figure out how to keep this from happening again, without needing me next time. Crane hesitated, then gave a tired, reluctant chuckle. Can you blame me? Jack leaned back in his chair. No. But here's the thing, what you need isn't more automation. You need people who know what they're doing. Real people. Hands-on. Smart enough to know when a sensor is lying and when a gut feeling means something. Crane exhaled, the weight of truth heavy in his voice. We screwed up. Jack raised the bottle to his lips. Yeah. You did. Another silence settled between them, thick with all the things they weren't saying. Finally, Crane cleared his throat. If you ever change your mind, the door's open. I won't, Jack said without hesitation. This time, Crane didn't push. Take care, Jack. You're gonna need the luck more than I will, Jack replied, and hung up. He looked out over the quiet street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. He could have felt vindicated. Triumphant, even. But instead, he felt something better. Clarity. He hadn't just walked away from Horizon. He'd walked toward something that mattered. There was still a place for people like him. People who didn't need algorithms to know when something felt wrong. The only difference now. He got to choose where and when to show up. The next morning, Jack returned to Oak Hill Community Center. The old building was still standing, still holding on, but it had weathered the blackout better than most. He spent a few more hours double-checking circuits, stabilizing the backup generator, and reinforcing the wiring. Because the truth was simple. There would always be another crisis. And he wasn't about to let this place fall through the cracks when that time came. Just as he was tightening the last bolt, Luis appeared in the doorway. You really don't know how to sit still, do you? He said with a grin. Jack glanced up, grinning back. This is different. Here, I work for people who actually appreciate it. Luis nodded thoughtfully, rubbing the back of his neck. I get that. But I could use a mentor. Someone who knows more than what the AI tells them. Jack looked at him for a long moment, then motioned toward the open toolbox. Well then, he said, don't just stand there, hand me that wrench. Luis grinned, walked over, and got to work. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, Jack packed up his tools and gave his hands a quick wipe with a rag. His phone buzzed, yet another job offer lighting up the screen. Another company scrambling to fix a mess before they turned into the next Horizon Energy. He didn't answer it. Not yet. He'd get to it when he was ready. After all those years working for people who thought they always knew better, people who believed experience could be replaced with an algorithm, Jack was finally in control. Free. As night fell, the city's lights blinked on one by one, casting a soft glow over the streets. But this time, he wasn't the one keeping them alive. And for the first time in 3 decades. He was perfectly fine with that. In a world changing faster than ever, we often forget the quiet, steady power of experience. Corporations chase speed and automation, cutting corners in the name of efficiency, believing that seasoned professionals can be swapped out like outdated hardware. But Jack's story reminds us of something essential. When we ignore the hands that built the foundation, the whole structure is at risk of collapse. Many of us have seen it up close, workers pushed aside, decades of skill dismissed, only for leadership to realize too late what they've lost. Maybe you've been in Jack's shoes. Maybe you've poured years into your craft, only to be told you were no longer needed. But if his story proves anything, it's this. Real expertise can't be shut off. When the moment of truth came, Horizon Energy didn't need another algorithm. They needed the guy they let walk out the door. Because what they had lost wasn't just a worker. It was someone irreplaceable. So what do we take from this? If you're leading a team, don't overlook the quiet value of experience. Machines may crunch numbers, but it's people who solve problems in the moments that matter. And if you're someone who's ever felt pushed out or left behind, know this. You are more than your job title. Your skill, your insight, your time-tested judgment, those things still matter. Sometimes, the doors that close on us are just making room for something better. Setbacks don't mean the story's over. They just mean the next chapter's going to be bigger. Speech balloon. Have you ever been replaced by technology, or watched it happen to someone else? Tell us about it in the comments. Bell subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where real-world stories reveal that experience isn't outdated, it's essential. Because no matter how fast the world changes, true value never fades.